My life in the rundown apartment complex had always been unremarkably comfortable, surrounded by a familiarity that only such close quarters can breed. The building, a decrepit giant among giants in the dense heart of the city, was a character in its own right, with each creak and groan telling tales of decades past. My apartment, a cozy one-bedroom on the third floor, was cluttered with relics of a life half lived, books, old vinyl records, and the occasional takeout container from days I couldn't muster the will to cook. My neighbors were like an extended family. There was Mr. Jacobs in 305, who taught math at the local high school and always had a problem that needed solving, and Eliza in 307, whose laughter often permeated the thin walls, a reminder of the lightness of life. We were a tapestry of souls, each with our own quirks and comforts, tied together by the shared threads of our environment. That evening, as I settled into the frayed comfort of my secondhand sofa, I was unaware that it would be the last slice of normalcy I'd experience. I had my feet propped up, a book open but unread as I listened to the rain patter against the window. It was soothing, a natural melody that promised a quiet night. The change began subtly. A thick fog rolled in, unusually dense and eerily silent, swallowing the cityscape whole. From my window, the familiar neon glow of the diner across the street was the first to disappear, enveloped in a gray shroud. The city's distant hum, usually a constant backdrop, was muffled under the weight of the fog, casting an unnatural stillness. As the fog thickened, the city's sirens began to wail, a distant yet urgent cry that seemed both a warning and a lament. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. This was no ordinary fog, no typical evening. When the power flickered and died, plunging my small world into darkness, a visceral fear gripped me, primitive and sharp. I reached for the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer, the beam flickering uncertainly as I shone it around the now shadowed room. The only light came from the odd luminescent fog outside, seeping in around the edges of the blinds. In that moment, a deep, unsettling growl rolled through the streets, a sound so alien and so close that my breath caught in my throat. It was then that the screams began, distant shouts filled with panic and confusion, echoing through the fog. Gathering my courage, I opened my door to the sounds of my neighbors' fearful voices in the hallway. We were all awake, all unsettled, all afraid. Together, we decided to lock and barricade the front door of the building. It seemed the only sensible action against whatever lurked in the misty veil outside. The decision to barricade the door brought us together in the dimly lit hallway, a congregation of anxious faces illuminated by the weak beams of flashlights and the odd phone screen. The atmosphere was thick with unease, each of us throwing glances towards the frosted glass of the entrance door, as if expecting to see something emerge from the mist. We worked in hurried silence, pushing the aging lobby furniture against the door, a makeshift barrier that felt as fragile as our resolve. As we fortified our communal front, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, dense and impenetrable. The city's sirens had escalated into a relentless cacophony, their warning cries merging into a symphony of dread that underscored the surrealism of the night. It was during these frantic efforts that the power sputtered and died completely, enveloping us in an oppressive darkness that seemed to amplify every sound. A cough, a whisper, a foot shuffling against the old tiled floor. "Shouldn't we check the news? See what's happening out there?" Mr. Jacobs's voice cut through the darkness, his tone a mix of fear and practicality. "I tried. Nothing's loading. Phones are dead or just can't get a signal," replied Eliza, her voice trembling slightly as she clutched her phone like a lifeline that had failed her. It was a stark reminder of our isolation, our sudden cutoff from the world beyond this fog-enshrouded fortress we reluctantly called home. The growls returned then, louder and more visceral than before. They seemed to surround the building, encircling us with a predatory intent that was felt more than understood. The sounds were unlike any animal I had heard before. They were guttural, deep, and resonated with a malevolence that chilled the soul. "We need to stay quiet and keep low," I whispered, the leader in me surfacing despite my own fear. My voice, though low, carried in the tense silence, and slowly my neighbors nodded, their faces pale shadows in the light of my flashlight. We retreated from the lobby back to the stairwell, the only slightly more secure space we could think of. As we huddled together, the temperature seemed to drop, the cold seeping into our bones as if the fog itself was invading the building. The eerie silence that followed was perhaps more terrifying than the growls. It was the calm that comes before a storm, laden with threat and promise of worse to come. We listened to our collective breathing, each exhale a whisper of fear, each inhale a gulp of damp, chilling air. Then all at once the silence was broken by a scream, a high, piercing sound that cut through the remaining barriers of disbelief. It came from the upper floors, a sound so full of terror that it propelled several of us to our feet. The reality of our situation was inescapable. We were not alone in our fear, and whatever was out there wasn't just an external threat. It had found its way inside. The scream that shattered the heavy silence sent a shockwave of terror through our huddled group in the stairwell. My heart pounded furiously, each beat echoing the dread that gripped us all. The instinct to run was overwhelming. But where could we go? The building had become a cage, and the fog outside was not just a barrier. It was a prison. Someone's in trouble. We can't just ignore it. Tom, a burly man from the second floor, murmured, his voice thick with fear yet edged with determination. His words stirred something within us, a reluctant courage that fought against the primal urge to hide. We gathered a few makeshift weapons, broom handles, a heavy wrench from Mr. Jacobs's toolbox, and a kitchen knife Eliza reluctantly handed over from her purse. As we crept up the stairs, the building seemed to groan under the weight of the oppressive fog that enveloped it, its walls whispering secrets of decay. Each step creaked, betraying our movements, as we ascended towards the source of the scream. The air grew colder with each floor, the breaths we took filled with the damp, musty scent of disuse. We reached the fourth-floor landing, and the hallway stretched ominously before us, the doors on either side like silent sentinels guarding their secrets. The screaming had stopped, replaced now by a heavy silence that seemed to pulse with hidden menace. A faint scratching sound echoed down the corridor, chilling in its implications. It was coming from Mrs. Langley's apartment, the door slightly ajar, inviting yet foreboding. With a collective breath, we pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the moon that fought its way through the swirling mist outside her window. The scene inside was chaotic, furniture overturned, curtains torn, and in the center of the room, Mrs. Langley sat huddled against her broken couch, her eyes wide with terror. "There was something," she gasped, her voice a hoarse whisper. "It came in through the window. Clawed, growling. I don't know where it went." We quickly moved to seal the window, piling whatever furniture hadn't been destroyed against it. The reality that these creatures could breach our homes so easily was a new horror. The thought of facing these unseen beasts was paralyzing, but the need to protect our own drove us. The growling started again, closer this time, more aggressive. It seemed to come from the hall, a low, continuous rumble that promised danger. We retreated into Mrs. Langley's apartment, barricading the door with the remnants of her furniture. Huddled together, we waited, each minute stretching into an eternity, every small noise a potential herald of attack. Outside, the sounds of chaos grew. The distant screams had multiplied, now joined by the unmistakable noise of shattering glass and the thuds of heavy bodies slamming against doors. Our building was no longer a refuge. It was becoming a battleground. As we waited, trapped in the dim, cramped space, the fear was palpable, a living thing that gripped each of us tightly, whispering dark thoughts of what the night would bring. The corridor was a cacophony of chaos and panic, the desperate cries of my neighbors echoing off the walls. Inside Mrs. Langley's apartment, we braced ourselves as the unsettling sounds of destruction grew nearer. The growling was omnipresent now, a terrible, throaty rumble that seemed to come from all directions. Our makeshift barricade felt increasingly fragile against the ferocity outside. With the situation worsening, I made a split decision, one that would haunt me forever. "I have to check my apartment," I announced, my voice a mix of fear and resolve. The truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of facing whatever lurked in the hallways, nor could I stand the guilt of seeing my neighbor's terror. The choice was selfish, born out of fear, but it was one I felt compelled to make. I left Mrs. Langley's side and hurried through the dim, flickering emergency lights towards my own apartment. The halls were eerily silent now. The earlier cries had ceased, leaving a heavy, oppressive quiet. As I locked myself in, the reality of my decision sank in. I had chosen isolation over solidarity. My apartment felt like a sanctuary and a prison all at once. I moved quickly, dragging my couch and bookshelves across the floor to barricade the door. The noise seemed impossibly loud in the silence, every scrape a beacon to those hunting outside. Then the building shook with a new intensity. The creatures had broken into another apartment down the hall. The sounds of splintering wood and shattering glass were unmistakable. The growls were louder, filled with a hunger that turned my blood cold. I retreated to the furthest corner of my living room, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath shallow and quick. As I crouched there, the noises outside my door intensified. The creatures were here, in the hallway I had just walked through. The sounds of their claws scratching against the wood of my door and the walls around it filled the room. It was a desperate, terrifying sound, one that spoke of imminent danger and a ruthless desire to find entry. The night wore on, each moment stretched into an eternity of fear. The attacks on my door continued. Each thud against the barrier I had erected a stark reminder of my solitude and vulnerability. But as the first light of dawn began to filter through the blinds, the assault waned. The creatures, whatever they were, began to retreat, their growls fading back into the fog that had brought them. Silence fell over the apartment complex once more, a silence that was far from comforting. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting has ended, filled with the weight of loss and the palpable presence of death. As I sat alone, surrounded by the barricade that had just barely saved me, I couldn't help but wonder about the fate of those I had left behind. The building was quiet, too quiet, and as the sun rose higher, I knew the day would reveal the full horror of the night's events.